I'm Ryan Balmer, and this is Berlin Re-Guided. You join me today in the centre of Berlin, once again, this time in a graveyard. It's called the Invalidenfriedhof, and today I want to talk about the graves of two men, Hans Karl von Winterfeld, a Prussian general who dies in battle in 1757, and Reinhard Heydrich, a Nazi war criminal who is assassinated in 1942. The time between the deaths of these two men, almost 2 centuries, would see the rise and fall of Prussia, one of the great European powers. Last time we saw how one of Berlin's most iconic buildings, the Reichstag, became a symbol of a number of different types of German state from 1871 to 1945. It was the state of Prussia that became the driving force behind the creation of the German Empire back in 1871. In all my years as a tour guide in Berlin, I've noticed that the very concept of Prussia creates a great deal of consternation and confusion. And that should come as no surprise, because what Prussia actually is or was changes drastically as the years roll by. The Prussia, for example, that existed in 1748, when this graveyard was first established, is a radically different Prussia from the one that still just about exists when this graveyard ceases to be used in the late 1940s. In all honesty, I intended to provide a lot more biography of Hans, but once I looked into him, I realised that his early life just wasn't that interesting. So today we're going to focus on what he could tell us about Prussia, and in particular that Prussian king, Frederick the Great, who rules from 1740 to 1786.
Majestat, ich spreche im Namen der Heimat. Für was glauben Sie denn, führe ich diesen Krieg? Für die Heimat.
The graveyard is also home to a relic from the Cold War era, a large fragment of the Hinterlandmauer, or inner Berlin Wall, built to provide extra security for the actual Berlin Wall by the East Germans. The Grave of Winterfeld, born in 1707 and killed in action 50 years later, can be found just behind this. Winterfeld had first been noticed by Frederick's father, the borderline psychotic Frederick William I, better known as the Soldier King, but he had ultimately become one of his son's most trusted allies through a series of personal and political troubles that the future king would encounter. The period in which men like Winterfeld were fighting and dying for Prussia marks the emergence of that state as a true European power for the first time. The ruling family, the Hohenzollerns, were now on a course that would culminate with the birth of the German Empire in 1871. Undeniably, his 3 immediate predecessors did a lot of the heavy lifting before him. But if I try to explain the entire history of Prussia in just 2 or 3 minutes, we're all going to end up with nosebleeds. The areas under Hohenzollern control by the time Frederick became king in 1740 are marked here in red. Principally, that means the land known as Brandenburg, which included Berlin, plus this area which for centuries had been referred to as Prussia. You'll notice that these territories are geographically separate. For a few decades now, people had been habitually using the term Prussia to refer to all the Hohenzollern territories that we can see here. Under Frederick the Great, Winterfeld would take part in 3 wars fought largely over this area called Silesia. The Prussians' principal opponents in the first 2 wars were the Austrians, led by Empress Maria Theresa, who generally sees Frederick as a real pain in the arse. The first 2 wars end up with Prussia in possession of Silesia. Winterfeld's rapid promotions through the ranks parallels Frederick's emergence as a skillful, but to be quite honest, generally lucky military commander. There's about a decade of comparative peace until the 7 Years' War begins in 1756. This is in the aftermath of what we call the diplomatic revolution, when long-held alliances, such as those between the Prussians and the French, are about to be reversed for quite serious geopolitical reasons, as well as less serious ones, such as Frederick the Great's inability to cease commenting on the sexual activities of his fellow heads of state. The map of alliances is drastically redrawn. The continent starts to be carved up in the traditional manner beloved by the various regal inbreds that ran things back then. We end up with something that looks like this: Prussia allied with Hanover and Britain, but effectively surrounded by these monsters.
Lassen Sie sich also gesagt sein. Ich werde gegen alle Regeln der Kriegskunst den 3-mal stärkeren Feind angreifen, wo ich ihn finde. Ich muss diesen Schritt wagen, oder alles ist verloren. Wir müssen den Feind schlagen oder uns alle von seinen Batterien begraben lassen. So denke ich, so werde ich handeln.
Apart from a few early victories, the 7 Years' War does not go well for Frederick. He even loses one of his oldest friends and most trusted generals, Winterfeld, at the Battle of Moys, just a few months after the war begins. But just when things were looking particularly bleak for Prussia in 1762, the Empress of Russia, who also regarded Frederick as a huge pain in the arse, dies after years of illness. This development ultimately leads to the collapse of that anti-Prussian coalition, and the war will ultimately end in something of a stalemate. As the war comes to a close, partly due to this stroke of luck then, Frederick and the Prussians still somehow have their hands on Silesia. Frederick's expansionist ambitions do not stop there though. Around a decade after the war ends, he helps negotiate what we call the First Partition of Poland, along with Austria and Russia. These 3 great powers help themselves to vast swathes of Polish territory. Sadly, this would not be the last time that something like this would occur to Poland. Crucially, this allows Frederick to unite the 2 main Hohenzollern territories for the first time. It would be inaccurate to say that Prussia's ascendancy as the great German power was now an inevitability, but this seed had undeniably been planted. Less than a century later, when the German Empire was established, we end up with this situation. Prussian land is marked this time in blue, which means around 3/5 of the territory and more than half of the population of the German Reich or Empire.
But these days, Prussia no longer exists, except in the fevered imaginations of a very creepy type of nationalist and a certain sort of tour guide with too much time on his hands. Huge chunks of former German and Prussian territory had been lost after 2 world wars, and in 1947 the Allies finally decided to extinguish any embers that were left of the Prussian state. Winston Churchill was in particular very critical of what he saw as Prussia's militarism and its role in not just 1 but 2 world wars. Under law number 46, drawn up by the Allied Control Council, Prussia simply ceases to exist as a political entity. To understand the motivation for this, we should look at the historical context in which the Nazis had placed themselves and at the crimes of Reinhard Heydrich. The Nazis were not particularly original thinkers, but they were very keen, selective students of history. Their hastily cobbled together mishmash of ideological nonsense borrowed from a variety of sources. But when it came to symbolism, it was arguably Prussia that provided the most inspiration. This had led Joseph Goebbels to claim that all over Germany, wherever we National Socialists stand, we are Prussians. Whether this was true or not is kind of a moot point. It was said often enough and loudly enough and with enough conviction for there to be more than enough appetite after the war, both outside and inside of Germany, for Prussia to be eradicated.
As I walk through the Invalidenfriedhof, searching for Heydrich's grave, I try and avoid the attentions of the janitorial staff, who I saw just a few minutes ago cleaning some of the graves. The last thing I want to be mistaken for is some kind of Nazi relic hunter, or even worse, some kind of enthusiast. Reinhard Heydrich's career in the Navy was cut short when he was decommissioned because of his repeated philandering. He then almost immediately joined the Nazi Party and was given a position of responsibility very early on by Heinrich Himmler. Heydrich would lead the fledgling SD, or the intelligence organisation of the Nazi security services. By 1939, Himmler had placed Heydrich in charge of the Reich main security office, which back then was found directly behind me in central Berlin. This put Heydrich in effective control of not only the SD, but the Gestapo and elements of the German police force. This made him one of the most powerful and dangerous men in Europe. By 1941, he was given even more responsibility when he was made the acting protector of Bohemia and Moravia. Truth be told, it's hard to find an act of state-sanctioned violence and terrorism back then that doesn't have Heydrich's fingerprints all over it. But what makes the most lasting and horrendous impact is his organisation of the Vansay Conference in January 1942. There he would convene representatives of the various security organisations under his control, as well as high-ranking members of the Nazi Party itself, where they would outline and discuss what would become known as the final solution to the Jewish question. Effectively, this would mean the mass murder of millions of men, women and children, primarily in the Nazi camp system. Less than 4 months later, in Prague, Heydrich would be assassinated by a group of Czechoslovakian operatives trained and parachuted in by the British Special Operations Executive. After an elaborate
funeral procession through Prague, the city that Frederick had terrorised in the months leading up to his death. His body was brought to Berlin for an even more elaborate funeral procession. It would arrive here at the Anhalter Bahnhof station. It was also one of the stations that was used to deport thousands of members of Berlin's Jewish community to concentration and extermination camps to the east. His body was then taken a short journey up Wilhelmstrasse behind me and laid to rest in the new Reich Chancellery building, which used to stand directly behind me. The Chancellery was an exercise in architectural folly, a gargantuan atrocity designed by Albert Speer. On June the 9th, 1942, the assembled dignitaries, if you can call them that, would endure literally hours of speeches in Frederick's name. Outside on the street behind me, thousands of members of the public clamoured, waiting for a glimpse of Frederick's coffin when it emerged. But behind the sombre expressions and the tears, something else was going on. Since their very early days, the National Socialists had been obsessed with martyrdom and self-sacrifice. This was a party that excelled in wallowing in self-pity and in a sense of unjustified self-righteousness. It's a party that thrived when they talked up the threat of seen and unseen forces alike. For one of their own to be assassinated, one so high up in the party, and in the eyes of some perhaps even the future of that party, must have been a moment of almost pure masochistic pleasure for the members of that apocalyptic death cult. Just across the street, across Wilhelmstrasse, as if they were overseeing this entire ludicrous scene, were a number of statues of Prussian war heroes from the past, mostly 18th century generals who played a role in Prussia's rise to prominence. Amongst them, of course, would be Hans Karl von Winterfeld. And before very long, he and Frederick would be sharing a final resting place at the Invalidenfriedhof. In all likelihood, this is the spot where Frederick ends up. The Nazi plans to erect an enormous tomb were put on hold because they were too busy with losing the war, and the much more modest temporary stone was removed by the Soviets after the end of the war. And you might have picked up on the fact that there has been a little bit of activity here in the not so distant past. The grave was in fact partially dug up by persons unknown as recently as December 2019. The authorities maintain that no bones were removed. Behind me are some fragments of the former Ministry of Propaganda led by Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels, from an early stage in the Nazi period, had attempted to forge what historian Christopher Clark refers to as an almost mystical union between the old Prussia and the new Germany. The party had used the early support of the old Hohenzollern princes to their advantage. They had used the image of Frederick the Great as inspiration. Joseph Goebbels was so enamoured by Karl Fröhlich's 1933 depiction of Frederick the Great that we glimpsed earlier that he commissioned him to make a bunch of propaganda films for the dictatorship. And in 1942, when it came to the sudden death of one of their own, it was decided that he should be buried alongside the men who had fought alongside Frederick all those years ago. Whatever Prussia had stood for, back when men like Winterfeld were around, was now tainted forever by the stain of genocide. If Germany was to be denazified, as the Allies had agreed upon in a admittedly vague manner back in July 1945 at the Potsdam Conference, then going after one of its greatest sources of inspiration seemed to be a pretty good start. Immediately after the war, historians, academics and politicians alike were tripping over themselves in an attempt to identify the core of the German problem. Prussia, or at least a selective summation of what Prussia was supposed to represent, seemed to be the answer to that problem. In any case, it would be a very long time before any other image of Prussia would be allowed to emerge from the shadows.